Hello and welcome to Faith Evolving. My name is Mary Claire, and today we're going to be talking about the history of the anti-vaxx movement and how it overlaps with Christianity. There is a lot of misinformation about COVID in Christian circles, and it fills me with what we in the biz like to call a righteous fury. Just a lot of rage, a lot of anger, and the challenge of this video was setting that aside to approach this history with compassion. And the funny thing is, the more I learned, the more compassionate I was. But it didn't change my convictions. I am unapologetically pro-vaccine, pretty much in general, but especially when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccine. I personally got vaccinated back in April. I actually got the Johnson & Johnson like 2 days before it was temporarily put on hold, which sent my anxiety into a tailspin. Ultimately, the vaccine ended up being okay, and there was just a little caveat added. And so, yeah, the fact that it was pooled and really taken into consideration as a sign that the vaccines and public health are being taken seriously. But all that aside, I was glad that I got one that was only one shot because ever since I was a little kid, I have been terrified by needles. I personally didn't really have that many side effects. Just basically my arm was sore for a few days and I was fatigued that day. But I took a 2-hour nap and I was fine. I do know side effects differ for everyone. My immune system just happened to react very mildly to it. But overall, the COVID vaccines are safe and are overwhelmingly effective. If you personally could be at risk for one or more of the vaccines or just the vaccine in general, if you talk to your healthcare provider or a healthcare provider and you let them know your medical and your health history, they will advise you on your best course of action. Nevertheless, there is an extremely vocal anti-vaccination movement, and it's spearheaded by many Christians. So, let's look into the history of the anti-vax movement in the States, because I am in fact a citizen of the United States, and we're really vocal and loud about everything because we feel the need to be special all the time.
I don't fit in, and I don't want to fit in.
Are you under 40? Have you ever had smallpox? No, because smallpox was declared eradicated in 1980, but it took a long while to get to that point. For centuries and centuries, smallpox was an incredibly contagious disease with a 30% mortality rate, and survivors were usually left with long-lasting side effects, including severe scarring and or blindness. Smallpox is so old, it's challenging to isolate its origins, but it is speculated to have originated 3,000 plus years ago, somewhere in the ancient world. And throughout the subsequent centuries, it spread throughout the rest of the world, either through trade and or colonization and just all the different wars that were waged in 3,000 years of history. In fact, smallpox was the primary disease that killed a lot of indigenous peoples when the Europeans were like, we discovered this new place no one's ever been before. Let's discount the fact that there are people here. Part of this was unintentional, just by way of their immune systems weren't used to it. And then also partially because once the Europeans found this out, they intentionally used smallpox as biological warfare. So yeah, smallpox sucked. But we will be picking up our story and really honing in 18th century New England, where both smallpox and accusing other people of witchcraft were running rampant. Reverend Cotton Mather was a fire and brimstone preacher in Boston, Massachusetts, who owned an enslaved person who he named Onesimus. Now, we only know of Onesimus through Cotton's journal. That's the only documentation. So we don't know his actual name or where and when from Africa he was captured. But one day, Cotton asked Onesimus if he had ever had smallpox before. And Onesimus told him about a procedure he had undergone where there was a bit of smallpox pus wiped into a cut on his arm, and it provided him immunity from the disease. And these inoculations were common and effective practices in the fight against smallpox in parts of Africa and Asia. So they weren't new, but to these Bostonians it sure was. And so the news spread like wildfire and quickly became divisive. It was actually religious leaders who favored these inoculations, whereas the medical community was opposed. However, some opposers did use religious arguments like, well, smallpox is from God as a punishment, so why are we trying to take control of God's plan? Also, if you've never heard of this idea before and didn't know that it had worked before, the idea of injecting someone with a disease to prevent them from getting the disease doesn't make sense. So chaos ensued and conspiracy theories were developed, partially because this knowledge was provided by an enslaved African man. So they're like, this is witchcraft. This is the minority populations trying to kill all the white people so they can take over. The way that history repeats itself is mind-numbing sometimes. But eventually, over many, many years, the community realized that these inoculations were effective. And a little over a century later, the smallpox inoculation/vaccine was actually mandatory in Massachusetts. But just as vaccines were becoming more popular, so did resistance to vaccines. And so many anti-vaccination leagues were formed. Now let's hop forward in time and turn to the 20th century. Again, actually still in Massachusetts. Vaccines were more commonplace at this point for many diseases. However, they had acquired a bit of a twisted history along the way. Public health departments did not go about vaccinating people in the most ethical way. They often would go to working class, especially like immigrant neighborhoods, and force people to get vaccinated. It was really messed up. They also went sometimes into predominantly Black neighborhoods and held people at gunpoint and put them in handcuffs if they didn't comply. In fact, many of the American health institutions, including the CDC, have a terrible track record of institutional racism when it comes to vaccines. This includes using Black and Indigenous communities as test subjects for vaccines and sometimes using them as a control group and just intentionally letting the disease run rampant, which is absolutely vile. And while this is no longer by any means common practice, it understandably has caused a deep mistrust in these health organizations for many Black and Indigenous individuals. And in 1901, the health organizations were on a bit of that bullshit. Additionally, while generally effective, vaccines were much riskier than they are today. Even just think, the idea of sterile surgery was relatively new in 1901. The medical practices and instruments and research were a much more rudimentary version than we have today. So missteps were more easily made, and sometimes they had tragic consequences. Unfortunately, one of these instances happened around the same time and affected 22 children from St. Louis and New Jersey who were vaccinated for smallpox, but that vaccine was pooled from a horse that had actually died from tetanus, or there was some sort of cross-contamination with tetanus where then those vaccines carried tetanus, and when they were administered, gave the children tetanus, and they died. In response, nearly immediately, there were federal regulations on biologic products, such as vaccines, to safeguard against this ever happening again. Today, these safeguards are overseen by the FDA, and it's not just like a one and done situation. It's a continuous process of making sure everything is okay. And a way of it that you can see was put into action was with the Johnson & Johnson. Something was going on, even though it was very, very, very rare. Immediately they put it on hold and they investigated it, and as soon as they had information, they put it out. And so while vaccines have always been effective, through modern medicine, we have made them increasingly safer and even more effective. So these stories in our history that I'm telling are not to say there's still issues now. It's more we have to deal with the legacy of these issues. So enter Reverend Henning Jacobson. We got another reverend. A Swedish immigrant and Lutheran pastor in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Jacobson had had a few bad experiences with vaccines in the past, but people who refused vaccination were charged a $5 fee, which was no problem for rich folks, but for the working class, it was inequitable. So, when Jacobson, scared of vaccines, refused to take it, declaring essentially my body, my choice, and then refused to pay the fine, it was a big deal. Like Supreme Court, big deal. And during the trial, Jacobson's lawyer drew upon religious imagery in the argument, stating, "Can the free citizen of Massachusetts, who is not yet a pagan nor an idolater, be compelled to undergo this rise and to participate in this revived form of worship of the sacred cow?" Nevertheless, Jacobson lost the case, but this tension between individual bodily rights and the common good of the community as a whole continues to riddle society today. In the mid-20th century, there was one final big outbreak of smallpox, but it was met and beaten with widespread vaccination efforts that were effective, and most people complied, for lack of a better term. And that is what allowed smallpox to be declared eradicated in 1980. But that's just the story of smallpox. There are a lot more diseases. And not long after smallpox was eradicated, the new anti-vaxx movement was on the come up. 1998, a medical article was published falsely claiming that the measles vaccine was linked to autism. And the general public freaked out. Now, this claim has been repeatedly disproven, and the doctor who did all this, Andrew Wakefield, is barred from practicing medicine because of all of the harm that this, and I cannot stress it enough, faulty connection has caused. Vaccines don't cause autism. They don't. If your child having autism is so devastating to you, you should probably check your priorities. Autism is not a death sentence. It doesn't need a cure. It needs acceptance and for us to actually listen to autistic people. So I've linked some resources in the description below. Rant over. But the hysteria surrounding this has lingered, and it's been bubbling, and it's been spreading. And we usually get the portrayal of these anti-vaxxer people as like your Karen in her like 40s or 50s, but studies show that it's millennial parents and now some Gen Z as they become parents are the ones who are most hesitant to vaccinate their young children because they grew up with this false narrative. And as a result, things like whooping cough and measles, which were near eradicated, are starting to make a comeback in areas where there are less vaccinated kids. Because the tricky thing about vaccines are they're more effective the more people that have them. So you're not just putting your own child at risk, you're also putting at risk the child whose parents did get them vaccinated. Because diseases mutate to try to overcome vaccines if you just let them run rampant. That's what they do. And this has been a problem like since 2015 or maybe even earlier. And it has primed America for the fear of the COVID vaccine that we are facing today. And it is affecting everyone, and it is deeply frustrating. Again, I'm a super vaccinated person, but I have kind of grown up as the anti-vax movement was growing, and I am lucky that I had a mother who did not buy into it. My mom's like, I'll shoot her up. I don't know what to tell you. All of my siblings are also super vaccinated, and we have always been generally healthy individuals. We didn't get sick a lot as children. I will say my family tends to have pretty strong immune systems. I don't know if that's genetics. I don't know if it's the vaccines. I don't know if it's the fact that there are a lot of teachers in my family, so they're used to encountering a lot of germs. Probably like a combination of all three. I'm not a doctor, but I can say that I am a firm advocate for vaccines. So here's a hella vaccinated person telling you to get vaccinated if you can. But if you've made it to the end of this video, you are probably already vaccinated. You've probably angrily clicked away by now if you aren't. So next week, I'm going to continue on this topic and talk a little bit more about the religious exemptions that are going on right now and the theological kind of arguments against the COVID vaccine and how it's in contrast to what most faith leaders are saying in Christianity, and then how to compassionately interact with the anti-vaxxers in your life who you care about. Because honestly, going into researching this video, I was gonna be like, anti-vaxxers are stupid and they're dumb. But now I'm like, there's a history of real pain here that can only be met with compassion if anything's going to get done. Because, I mean, you and me both know if you yell at someone, they're just going to dig in their heels more. So thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Was there anything that you found really interesting that you hadn't heard of before? Research. Stay safe out there. I'm so sick of this pandemic. I'm so sick of it. And remember, if you're rich and white, vaccines have always been safe for you, Jenny McCarthy. They've always been safe for you. My mic went out, but goodbye.